Okay, we'll continue focusing source point to source point to be one with each other while I'll be talking about the documentary Buck, still focus on the energetic merging that we're doing. Buck is a documentary that came out actually this past summer, and it's referring to a person named Buck Brannaman, who is a horse whisperer and is a shaman by my definition. And the reason I wanted to talk about this today is that he's sort of like almost like the classic model from an energetic point of view of a shaman in terms of his energetic structure and how he functions, at least some of the time. And if you haven't seen the documentary, you can see the trailer. And it's a very moving story, so I'm only going to be talking about one aspect of it from an energetic point of view. But it's a very moving story about humanity as well. And I also like to talk about this because here's a person who grew up as a cowboy, worked on a ranch. As far as I know, has done nothing with any traditional shamans. Doesn't sound like it. He doesn't beat a drum. He doesn't put feathers in his hair. And yet he is still functioning in many ways like a shaman. However, the way he does this is mainly with horses in relationship to people. And one of the things I will point out right away that I was very surprised after looking at this a number of times and kept reading the energy and trying to tune into all the different things happening, was that I first had one of my first experiences with a traditional shaman was a Hopi medicine person. I drove about 8 hours to the north from here to do some healing on me. And so I've always been assuming that a shaman is doing this merging, energetic connecting with people in the ceremony or the healing that he or she, the shaman, is involved in. What I was very surprised to find is that Buck merges with horses, but not with people. And if you hear his whole story about how he grew up with a very violent alcoholic father, eventually going to live with a foster family on a ranch, that you might maybe there's a sense of understanding how this might be the case. But the point is that Buck is not a traditional shaman. He doesn't seem like he was trained in his shamanic traditions, but because of his relating to horses, he gradually, apparently, developed some of these abilities, and it just happens to fit my criteria from energetic reading of being a shaman. So anyway, I mainly want to use him as an example of how I define a shaman. Generally, I talk about a shaman as someone who functions through other dimensions of existence to impact this dimension of existence, this what I call our incarnated dimension. So I'll briefly go over the idea of dimensions here in the conceptual framework that I've come to understand over the last 20 years. There are like 20 different dimensions. We can think of this symbolically as like a pyramid. And if you had 20 even slices here, say a 20-foot pyramid, and each section is a foot high. This is a very hypothetical way of thinking about this. This is a very, very loose, vague analogy to help us understand this. That each dimension is a different frequency of these 20 dimensions, and that's what really differentiates the different dimensions. And the dimension at the top of the pyramid is the slowest, and the dimension at the bottom has the fastest frequency. And anything that exists in a dimension at the top of the pyramid also exists in some version, but at a different frequency, in all of the other versions of the pyramid beneath. So we as humans exist in what I call the first dimension. My concept of dimension is different than some people in esoteric perspectives. I'm talking about dimensions of existence. And we exist in all 20 dimensions, but we function only in one of these dimensions, at least the average human being does. Now, there are other types of beings that exist in the second dimension, that do not exist in the first dimension, but they exist in all the dimensions beneath them in this pyramid, as an analogy. And so the more dimensions that a person functions through, and able to then, when they're doing ceremony, when they're doing healing or transformational processes, they're able to function at these other dimensions and have an impact upon us. Say if they're doing a healing with us, at these other, they're doing it on more than one level, so to speak, more than one dimension, which has more impact. This is one of the reasons that a shaman sometimes can do certain things that most people cannot do. Physicians function only in the first dimension, generally. Massage practitioners, Reiki practitioners, acupuncturists, Rolfers, body workers, psychotherapists, unless they're developed as a shaman, generally these modern day roles, the people are functioning only through the first dimension. Now, one could be a shaman and be a psychotherapist, say, but generally traditional shamans that we talked about in the last get-together energy circle, when we talked about the documentary The Horse Boy, there the shamans in Mongolia, the first group, they were functioning through the first 4 dimensions. And the last one we saw with the reindeer people, he was functioning through all 20 dimensions. And he was the one that had the most impact on this autistic child, which is the feature, was what the Horse Boy documentary was about. Anyway, here's Buck, who is not a traditional shaman, but he is functioning through the first 4 dimensions, like some of the traditional shamans in Mongolia. Now, the way I break this down into thinking in terms of, in a more technical way, what a shaman is not simply someone who's functioning through other dimensions to impact this incarnated dimension, this first dimension that we're in. The way I think of it is that to be able to function in these other dimensions, we have to develop certain energetic structures. I call this set of structures the shamanic infrastructure, or the interdimensional intent functioning infrastructure, which is a set of structures that anyone can develop, although not necessarily easily, anyone can develop. And as they develop these, they enable us, as a human being, to function through other dimensions. Buck has developed the first 4 of these structures, of the 20 structures of the shamanic infrastructure. There are 20 dimensions, but there are also 20 structures of the shamanic infrastructure. These first 4 have to do with 1, perception, 2, intensification of energies, 3, interdimensional merging, and 4, interdimensional transformation. And to be able to, one can develop these a little bit, but they have to be extensively developed to really be effective. So he's developed extensively these first 4 structures of a shamanic infrastructure. That's one criteria. The second criteria for me to call a person a shaman, whether it be traditional or contemporary, male or female, the second criteria is that the person has developed what I call the energy wisdom processes or modifiers. The third dimension I call the wisdom dimension. The fourth dimension I call the primordial energy dimension. If we access that, we have to also be able, those dimensions, before we can function through them, we have to be able to process, to modify what is in that dimension so we can take advantage of it in this incarnated dimension that we're in. Now, when we go into dream state, we access the third dimension, what I call the third dimension, which is different than a lot of other esoteric perspectives. The wisdom dimension. But that's just perceiving. I'm talking about being able to really do things, have an impact, in addition to just perceiving, to be able to function in. And so he's developed all 4 of these energy wisdom processors, as I call them. The third criteria for me to call a person a shaman is to develop what I call the double. This shamanic infrastructure, or set of energetic structures, enables us to function through more than one dimension. Once it develops enough, it sort of like has an autopilot most of the time as we're developing our shamanic infrastructure, the way we're doing it is because we're very consciously intending, consciously focusing in doing ceremony, whether it be traditional ceremony or New Age ceremony or prayer or dancing or whatever we might be doing. If we're intending it consciously, then this is where we start to develop shamanic infrastructure. But at some point, we develop sort of like the autopilot for the shamanic infrastructure, so that it's able to do 24/7 without our consciously intending to be doing, to be functioning in these other dimensions. And it's not very common that people have developed this, what I call the double. That's just the way that I define a double. It's sort of like, the analogy, which you've heard me say before probably, is sort of like breathing. So I consciously focus on altering my breath. I can go to sleep at night and I'll still continue to breathe, although I may not speak very clearly. And so the autonomic nervous system takes over and continues to breathe us. There's an equivalent idea of a subtle energetic structures as a part of the shamanic infrastructure, that when the double becomes developed, it automatically manages the functioning of the shamanic infrastructure 24/7. Now, there are people who've developed some parts of like the first two parts, functioning through the first 4 dimensions, who have great perception abilities, who are able to access and process the energies from other dimensions, but have not developed the double, or they haven't developed something else. And when I talked about last month the energies in the energy circle, went into the horse boy, this autistic child, he was functioning through the first 4 dimensions. He also had incredible abilities to perceive, in many ways like a shaman. However, because he had not developed other parts of the shamanic infrastructure, this is part of my hypothesis, is because he had not developed other parts of shamanic infrastructure like a shaman, he was much more in the effect. See, the 4th dimension is the primordial energy. There's a lot of intense energy there. And if you're accessing it and living in it, it's intense. And if you've developed these perception catalysts, as I call them, to perceive in other dimensions, you can perceive subtle energies in a way that most humans can't, the world is very, very intense. This is at least how I think of it. But if you develop other parts of the shamanic infrastructure, including the double, you're able to process this so that you're able to live with it, even though life can be intense. You're able to live with it. It's not knocking you over all the time. It's sort of like it's intense, but we can direct it. We can dance with the energies. And so some people, such as at least some people characterized as autistic, some people characterized as ADD, attention deficit disorder, or ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity, I think it is, hyperactivity disorder. Also, people who have Down syndrome, and so that in many ways they look like a shaman in certain aspects, but they've not developed, at least usually, they've not developed enough parts of the shamanic infrastructure to manage this functioning in a smooth manner. But the most people on the planet are functioning through only the first dimension, which is fine, except that the functioning through more and more dimensions enables us to do and to function in life in a whole different way than if we're only functioning in one dimension. Also, the general categories of people that I seem to find who are functioning through the first 4 dimensions or more pretty fully: 1 are traditional shamans, 2, some of the high Tibetan lamas, such as the Dalai Lama and the Karmapa. Also, some really avant-garde scientists, such as Tesla, the people who discovered or were involved in discovering, at least became publicly acknowledged as discovering the double helix, or part of the DNA idea. Einstein, Stephen Hawking, these really cutting-edge scientists. Many of them are functioning through all 20 dimensions. Steve Jobs, who recently died, the head of Apple, blew me away, because by the time he had died, he was functioning through all 20 dimensions. Not when he started Apple Computer, but by the time he was when he died, just in this past year. So there are some really incredible people who are not traditional shamans who have developed this shamanic infrastructure and functioning through more than four or more dimensions. But for most of us, it just doesn't happen that we develop these other energetic structures to do that. Now, so that's sort of the basic criteria to call someone, for me to call someone a shaman. And I will say there are very, very, very few contemporary people who call themselves shamans whom I would call a shaman. But that's just by my definition. Anybody can call themselves whatever they wish. That's their own prerogative. But I do feel that a lot of what is being called contemporary shaman or contemporary shamanism is really missing the boat. And here is someone who's a cowboy, who's not been trained in any shamanic techniques apparently, who's really a classic example in many ways of being a shaman. Two other aspects, or a few other aspects that often associated with the person who I would call being a shaman, that Buck exemplifies. One is his abilities to perceive subtle energies. You don't necessarily see the energies or hear the energies, but there's this being able to perceive subtle energies in other dimensions. And for him to be a horse whisperer, it's important to be able to get a sense of people and horses in terms of what he's doing with them. So he has some database here, information coming in that most people don't perceive, or they have it very, very vaguely. So he's developed a classic part of the perception catalysts that I associate with shamans: the navel, to feel, in the center of the head, third eye area, to see, and the one about 6 or 8 inches above the top of the head that I call the to hear. It's just loose language to try to describe perceiving of energies that are sort of like to feel, to see, to hear in other dimensions. He's developed those. He's also developed the ability to merge, but only with his, what I call the light body fibers, or currents of energy that come from his navel area, and a part of the structure that I call the light body, which I won't describe right now. But it's a very energetic part of ourselves, of being a human being. And he's able to extend out these fibers to merge with a horse. So it's like he's merging with a horse and directly hooked up with that particular horse. I kept seeing this, or reading this energetically. I don't see energy, I read energy. I kept seeing this with what he was doing with the horses, including in the documentary where he's dealing with a very disturbed horse. He was very violent. And yet he stays in the ring with the horse all the time, and he's able to get the horse, at least managing to get him off the land without Buck being kicked, or say. But he was able to merge with the horse in a way that he sort of gets into sync energetically with the horse. Secondly, and he's able to resonate his energies as if he were a horse. It's a lot of traditional shamanism. There's a lot of focus on shape-shifting, and the way I interpret that is not actually changing the physical body shape, but literally being able to resonate your energies as if you were a hawk, as if you were a crow. But here, Buck is able to vibrate his energies as if he were a horse. So it's sort of like, I imagine a horse is looking at this guy. It says, two-legged, smells like a human, making sound like a human, but there's something about him as a horse. It's very interesting at one point here, and this is one of the outtakes. I get the DVD version of the documentary rather than watching it online, because the DVD version has outtakes and commentary. I learned a lot more by listening and watching those as well. And his wife talks about Buck as, it's almost like he has horse in him. He can relate to them in a completely different way than anybody I've ever seen. Now, they show briefly in the documentary some images, photographs of two of his teachers, horse whisperer teachers, whom he studied with, or at least studied with one primarily, and another one was a teacher of his teacher, it seems like. Both of those people, one of whom I would define as shaman, the other person was almost a shaman by my definition, had the ability to, one, send out their light body fibers to merge with the horse, and secondly, they were able to resonate their energies with, as if they were a horse. Now you might recognize this also from the shaman cards, because this set of cards I finally came out with last year, and it's an energetic ceremony we do where we intend to energetically function, to vibrate as if we were a whale, or a smoky quartz crystal, or a certain type of a tree. And we just practice that over all these 20 different cards. It turns out, this is how I began to even ask the question about this, that Buck and some other horse whisperers, as I've looked at a few other horse whisperers, at least people who identify themselves as horse whisperers, what they're able to do is not only merge with the individual horse, but they're able to resonate their energies, vibrate their energies, as if they were a horse. And that's exactly what we practice to do in the shaman cards. So that seems to be a characteristic, so that even though a person's walking around perhaps in spurs or boots and a cowboy hat or cowgirl hat, they can still be a human and add in this additional vibratory pattern as if they were a horse. So that the horse sort of, I'm guessing, relates to, this is a strange looking horse, but must be a horse. So this is one of the things that's really key, I think, in becoming a horse whisperer. I would suspect the same for a dog whisperer. I've heard about people like that. So being able to vibrate our energies like another type of being is really important if we want to relate to that other type of being, whether it be a tree, or a hawk, or a rattlesnake, or whatever. It's sort of like we become energetically also that type of a being. So that's some other characteristics that generally shamans have developed, and this is one of the reasons that Buck can be such an effective horse whisperer, because he's functioning through 4 dimensions, he's impacting the horse in 4 dimensions, he's perceiving at least 4 dimensions, he's able to vibrate as if he were a horse, and the horse can then relate to him in a different way. So that's some of my observation. So we have a few more minutes here. Does anyone have any questions about what I said, or have any reflections from what you've seen watching the documentary? Does anyone have anything?
You answered my question. I wanted to ask about his teachers, whether they were shamans as well. So that was I had to ask.
One of them is.
It looked like they were functioning as shamans, but I couldn't really.
One was.
I don't mean it looked like it. It just felt like they were.
Yeah, they. One when I read his energy, the older of the 3, he was functioning as a shaman from my reading. The one that was Buck's immediate teacher was functioning through the first 3 dimensions, not through the first 4 dimensions. So.
I can't remember which. There was one of them that seemed. I don't know. Anyway, I'm kicking myself now that I hadn't kind of watched that bit through again, because I did mean to ask you about that.
Yeah, so I think to be an effective horse whisperer, one generally probably has to function through more than 1 dimension. And so simply a modern day version of a human being functioning in such a manner, like a shaman, but doesn't look like a traditional shaman. And as we develop our contemporary forms of shaman and shamanism, I think it's very valuable to understand it from an energetic point of view, rather than simply learning some other culture's ceremonies and then repeating them. And there's nothing wrong with that, and I'm not opposed to that. I love to do other cultural ceremonies. I love to do them. I'm a ceremony slut. I can pray at anybody's altar pretty much, or whatever version of the ceremony it is. That's cool, and it's meaningful. And if you enter the sweat lodge counterclockwise, great. Counterclockwise, great. I don't care. It's just like if you approach this from an energetic point of view, rather than from a symbolic or attitudinal or from a behavioral point of view, then you're in a whole different ballgame. And what I begin to observe with Native American medicine people that I've been around here in the Southwest is at first I thought it was what they were doing externally. And what they're doing externally is meaningful, and sometimes a part of the alchemy is important, but basically what they could do with their energies that was unseen, that was where the magic was. That was where the power was. And that's, unfortunately, just repeating other people's ceremonies may not help us to get there. I can agree, but we got to go beyond that. When I learned what was called the sacred pipe ceremony, my teacher said, you have the stem and the bowl, and it has the buffalo hide here, and the crystalline here, and all that, but your pipe is inside you. And the external form of doing the pipe is a way of helping you connect with doing this ceremony within yourself. So that in a sense, the ultimate or the primary objective was eventually to get to the place where you were doing the ceremony internally and the external form made no difference. Although it's important in some ways, it's not the real essence, it's not the real primary thing. Right.
The other thing that you said about that was quite interesting, when you were saying about the fact that he actually merged with the horses, not with people, and almost effectively related to horses rather than the people, or related, sort of I thought that was quite interesting because I was also thinking about my mother. I mean, she related to plants in the same way. She couldn't relate to people, but she could relate to plants, and she kind of related to people through plants. If that makes sense. So yes, it was a similar kind of thing. And I know she wasn't a full-blown shaman, but she was definitely in that direction. And the other, I've often thought I find it easier to relate to dead people than I do to people who are in their bodies. And it's a similar kind of thing. It's easier to sort of just, sort of get to the live people through the dead people.
To the spirit.
But I do think it's easy, isn't it? If you can kind of find some kind of in-between being to relate to, then you can go and do the normal bit, the other side of it.
It may be, as you're saying that, because a lot of traditional shamans, they often they have a totem of some kind or a certain type of being, often an animal that's so important for them. Here, every Easter, we have what's called the Yaqui deer dance ceremony, which is traditional in Yaqui, but they adapted to the Christian version of Easter. And so they have these little children, this young boy usually out there, acting like a deer, moving like a deer, like becoming a deer in many ways. So that process it can be very, very important, I think, in traditional shamanism and as well as contemporary situations. Now, one thing I want to add is when I saw him live this weekend, this was very interesting for me.
Oh, right, I forgot you saw him, yeah.
I saw him live, went out there, and boy, we had some hot weather. It was like 27 Celsius, 80 Fahrenheit, and there was no shade. And here was Buck out there in the arena with about 17 other cowboys and cowgirls. But this was not a beginning class. This was not, quote, breaking horses or getting a horse to be ridden. This was experienced cowboys and cowgirls. We live in the Southwest, and there's still a few ranches in this area, where the horse was very well trained. The riders had many years of experience. We had people from, I'm guessing, a woman in her 20s to people into their 60s. Some were a little bit pouchy. Most people were in quite good shape. And they were out there riding their horses continuously. They were taking these calves and separating them so they could learn how to, not so much to rope them, but how to relate to your horse just by moving the weight of your body, moving right leg forward, left leg forward, keeping the reins loose. I knew nothing about this. I have a great deal more respect for cowboys and cowgirls now, people who are out there working, and that's hard work. It was just amazing how hard it was, what they were doing, to do that all day long. But he was working with people who were already experienced in horsemanship, or horsepersonship, and was getting them to be more refined in their movements, teaching. And so what I noticed was he wasn't doing any merging, at least as far as I can tell. It didn't look like the Buck, energetically, that I saw in the documentary, because the documentary was focusing more on dealing with horses that were either really disturbed, or the humans were very disturbed and made the horses crazy, or getting a horse used to being ridden for the first time. So what he was teaching was finesse skills on how to ride a horse rather than how to relate to a horse. So it was a whole different focus on this. And these were people who've been to his classes before. This is not an introductory class, I see. So I didn't learn anything about energy other than to say, oh, I guess he uses this when he needs it, when he's relating to a horse, to get a horse into a relationship to be ridden, especially for the first time or initially, or get the horse to feel safe, and teaching the rider how to relate to the horse in a different way, and without see, traditional horse breaking is like you beat the hell out of them apparently to get them to submit. In Buck's way of teaching is you get into simpatico with them, you get into sync with them, and so that the horse becomes a cooperative, willing partner in this process, rather than being beaten into submission. And so it's a whole different way of relating to horses, and it's incredible for me to hear both things, because I grew up in a farm more like situation. I didn't have any horses. So anyway, so this class was a very different class, and and he's not a traditional shaman, so he didn't start this with a traditional ceremony of any kind. Even and here we have what we call powwows, where a local Indian tribe or a group of people will have a gathering of people usually from many different tribes come together and do competitive dancing, and you have face painting for the children, and so it's a social gathering. But the very first thing, everyone I've ever been to, the very first thing they do every day, they do a dance where the veterans or the warriors do a certain dance, and what they're doing is, when I finally saw this whole thing through, because it was not the pretty competitive dancing, it was just much more back and forth, it was just sort of plain dancing, or a certain pattern to it with the drum and the singers. And when I finally saw the whole thing from beginning to end, I felt this energetic shift, so that like they were laying an energetic spiritual foundation for which then you did a social event. The powwows are basically social events, but they began it with a ceremonial spiritual foundation. You start with a prayer. Buck that day, he didn't do anything. If he did it silently, but there was no ceremonial preparation for teaching this class. He just went out there and was teaching these people how to do, how to be more effective with their horse in relating to cows. So it was very, very interesting to see this, and how you can still be a shaman and not be approaching it ceremonially, but you've still energetically developed certain things. But it's not quite the same as when you sort of, your life is ceremonial. And traditional shamanism, it seems to be a lot more ceremonially focused. So I learned a lot about how hard it is to be a cowboy. I also learned about none of the people out there were wearing the same hat. Your hat style is your signature. There's no designer popular hat out there. There were, I think there were 18 different people. There were 18 different hats for sure. It was very interesting. It's very interesting to observe that. So I learned about cowboy cowgirl culture, which is very meaningful for me. But I didn't learn much about shamanism, other than he did not approach this in a ceremonial manner. Anybody else have any comments or reflections in this? So, you all have a wonderful night there in Scotland, and we'll be in contact.
Yeah.
Take care, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.